Welcome back to the Civil Rights Academy Awards. For the first one, we're kicking off with the Best Picture. Arkansas Central High School. The school was a site of forced desegregation in 1957 after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the segregation of public schools was unconstitutional 3 years earlier. The government had to step in to bring armed troops to walk the students safely into the school because the Arkansas governor was trying to keep black people out of the schooling system. Number 2. Montgomery bus boycotts. Political and social protests campaigning against the policy of racial segregation on the public transit system of Montgomery, Alabama. March on Washington. The Great March on Washington was held in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, August 28, 1963. The purpose of the march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. Number 4. Chicago Freedom Movement. Led by Martin Luther King Jr., it brought the housing segregation movement to take off and succeed in framing anti-poverty efforts. And the winner for the Best Picture is Arkansas Central High School. Other than that, let's kick it over to Tyler with the Best Director.
And the nominees for Best Director is A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph brought the gospel to trade unionism to millions of African American households. Randolph led a 10-year drive to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, BSCP, and served as the organization's first president. The second nominee is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and social rights activist in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. He was a leader of the American Civil Rights Movement. He organized a number of peaceful protests as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, including the March on Washington of 1963. And the last nominee is Adam Clayton Powell. Adam Clayton Powell is a Baptist pastor and American politician who represented the Harlem neighborhood of New York City in the United States Home of Representatives from 1945 until 1971. He was the first African American to be elected from New York to Congress. The winner is Adam Clayton Powell.
Best Actress in a Leading Role Award. For our first nominee, we have Rosa Parks. She became one of the most famous civil rights activists after refusing to give up her seat to a white man on the bus. This started the public transportation boycotts and eventually resulted in a nationwide effort to end segregation on public transportation. For our next nominee, we have Kathleen Klivar. She became the first woman to serve on the Central Committee of the Black Panther Party, where she eventually developed communications strategy to reach the media. She later graduated from Yale and became a law professor. And for our final nominee, we have Aileen Hernandez. She became the first African American woman to be appointed to the first African American president of the National Organization for Women. She was a true pioneer in the issues concerning the intersectionality of race, sex, and class. And the winner is Aileen Hernandez.
The next nominees for the Best Original Screenplay is Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was an American civil rights activist who was an advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. and who was the main organizer in the March of Washington in 1963. Claudie Colvin. Claudie Colvin is a pioneer of the 1950s civil rights movement and a retired nurse aide. On March 2, 1955, she was arrested at the age of 15 in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a crowded, segregated bus. And the last nominee is Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was a civil rights activist whose passionate depiction of her own suffering in a racist society helped focus attention on the plight of African Americans throughout the South. And the winner is Claudie Colvin.
For the next award, we have Best Group or Organization. First nominee is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. It was established in 1960 and mainly focused on planning sit-ins, voter registration drives, and protests during the Civil Rights era. For the next nominee, we have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, which was established in 1957 and worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. and local organizations and churches to build its membership. The conference sponsored programs such as the Selma Voting Rights March and the Birmingham Campaign. And for the final nominee, we have the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, the oldest and most recognized civil rights organization in the U.S., which had more than 500,000 members working locally and nationally to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality for all and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination. And the winner is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
The nominees for the best court case or legislation, the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 states that no person in the United States shall, or on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal finance assistance. The second nominee is Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. The Education Amendments of 1972 prohibit sex discrimination in any educational program or activity receiving federal finance assistance. And our final nominee is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 forbids organizations and employers from excluding or denying individuals with disabilities and equal opportunity to receive program benefits and services. It defines the rights of individuals with disabilities to participate in and have access to program benefits and services. The winner is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Best Actor in Leading Role. Malcolm X was an African American leader in the civil rights movement, minister, and supporter of black nationalism. He urged his fellow black Americans to protect themselves against white aggression. Medgar Evers, civil rights activist Medgar Evers, was the first state field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi. As such, he organized voter restrictions efforts and economic boycotts. Martin Luther King. He was the driving force behind events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the 1963 March on Washington, which helped bring about the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Acts. And the winner is Martin Luther King.
Last but not least, we have the People's Choice Award. For the first nominee, we have the March on Washington, a peaceful protest that took place on August 28th, 1963, with around 250,000 people gathering around the Lincoln Memorial to draw attention to the ongoing challenges African Americans were facing. It is also where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his infamous I Have a Dream speech. For the next nominee, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This was a big step in the right direction for civil rights activists, as the act also ended the Jim Crow laws. And the third nominee is Jimmy Lee Jackson, a Vietnam War veteran who attended a meeting at Zion Chapel Methodist Church, followed by a vigil in support of recent arrested civil rights activists. After local police attacked members, Jackson was shot and killed a few days later. His death caused SNCC leaders to organize the first march from Selma to Montgomery, which would eventually result in the 1965 Voting Rights Act being passed. And the winner is Jimmie Lee Jackson.